Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the CTNS Forum today. This is our first hybrid event, so we're excited to test it out and see how it goes, and thanks for joining us. I'm Bob Russell. I'm the founder and director of the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences. And I'm the Ian G. Barber Professor of Theology and Science at the GTU. The mission of CTNS is to promote the creative mutual interaction between theology and science through three program areas: research, teaching, and public service. And this forum, of course, comes under public service, bringing the fruits of our research to the wider audience. And delighted you're here. Thanks for your attending. And after I will introduce our speaker, but I'll tell you the format first. Levi will speak for about 55 minutes. There'll be time for Q&A, and then we'll wrap it up. So it's my pleasure to introduce Levi Checketts. We say, sorry. Levi is an associate professor of religion and philosophy at Hong Kong Baptist University. He's a 2018 graduate of the GTU and recipient of the Charles H. Towns Fellowship from CTNS. His research focuses on Catholic social ethics and new technologies. He leads a committee on artificial intelligence concerns from an Asian perspective for the Pontifical Council for Culture and serves as networking fellow for AI and Faith. He has a forthcoming 2-volume edited book, Theology and Technology, from Wipf and Stock, and is currently writing a book on AI epistemology and the preferential option for the poor. It's a pleasure to welcome you, Levi. Thank you so much for giving us this forum.
Thank you, Bob. It's my pleasure to be here. I don't really have much introductory comments. I want to give a sense of what I'm talking about today. Is one of the elements that Bob mentioned in my bio. I'm leading this group of researchers in Asia talking with the Pontifical Council for Culture about social and ethical AI concerns. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about how this group came to be, and then a little bit about the group itself, who it's composed of, and give you a sense of some of the things we've talked about, some of the important issues that have come up, some of which I think are a bit surprising to see how the conversations have gone. So, and then after that, I'll give sort of a sense of how we're going forward, what the new directions are, maybe some of the persistent questions, and then we can open it up for discussion. To begin with, Pontifical Council for Life, or for Culture, began taking an interest in AI a couple of years ago. The Pontifical Council for Life also did this. Some of you may be aware, maybe not, that there was a Rome call for ethics that came out for AI ethics, and that was initiated by the Pontifical Council for Life. The Vatican has become very interested in issues regarding artificial intelligence, not because they want to baptize it or something like that, but because they realize that this is a very interesting and important direction for technology, and has a lot of impact and repercussions on society. And as a leader of faith, they want to have their ears to the ground and know how to respond appropriately. So initially, there was a plan to have a symposium with Santa Clara University's Markkula Center for Ethics in March of 2020, and this would have included a number of scholars, many associated with CTNS, graduates of CTNS, such as Brian Green and other people from the GTU and from across the country actually as well, including Noreen Hertzfeld, also a graduate of the CTNS. And of course, what we know is March 2020, everything went to pot. So the plan for this big conference was postponed, and this group of initially 10 scholars that they had compiled, we decided that rather than say it's all for naught, and not knowing at the time that we didn't know when we would be able to meet in person, they decided to conduct things virtually. So between April 2020 and July 2021, I was part of a group. They broke up into 3 different interest groups, and the one I was a part of was relationality and relationships. And in this group were also Noreen Hertzfeld, Jordan Wales from Hillsdale College, Corey Lebrec from University of Quebec, and Brian Green at Santa Clara University. And we would meet once a month and discuss various issues related to relationships, relationality, as it ties into AI. So, of course, there were big questions about can one have a relationship with AI, but then more questions focused on the way it changes our relationships, the way it changes our impact, our connection with others, the way it facilitates or damages that, things related to how we understand labor, how we understand love and sex, how we understand emotions, and all of that came out in these conversations. They're very interesting, and it was a great pleasure to be part of this group. But in April of last year, I received what was very good news for me, working as an adjunct for about 4 years in the Bay Area. Actually, longer than that, but after graduating, that I was going to be hired on by Hong Kong Baptist University. Of course, the time difference between California and Hong Kong is about 13 hours, which means that the meetings that they were having here would be at a very inopportune time for me to join in. And so it was going to be difficult for me to continue if I wanted to. Fortunately, though, the Pontifical Council for Culture and I saw this as a great opportunity, a new possibility, because at the time, all of the people who were participating in these conversations were located either in the United States or Canada, or we had a few members that had recently joined who were from Europe. So it was very Western focused, almost exclusively white, and there was a dearth of perspectives coming from other parts of the world. And so because the Pontifical Council for Culture is focused on how things are impacting the world, we saw this as a new possibility. So how do we then begin talking about the specific issues that affect Asia? Because of our North American audience and our European audience, they're focusing on, there were discussions about the EU and EU regulations, North American treaties, how does the United States regulate AI? But these are different questions from what we might see in Asia, especially because there are countries that are developing, that are poorer, there are countries that are trying to catch up. China, Korea, and Japan are now really on the leading edge of a lot of AI work, but haven't been included in many of these conversations before. So this was a new opportunity, but the challenge arose that I would have to put together a committee. So it fell to me, and I took this very seriously, to find people. And I wanted to make sure that we had a broad representation of people who were from different countries, who were from different disciplines, who had experience writing or were from different belief traditions, and that this would help us to get a broader perspective rather than just having a group of Christians, for example, getting people who are from different traditions. Now, this became very difficult because what I found was some countries had a lot of people who were focused on this work already. Korea was actually really high up there. Many graduates from CTNS who have returned to Korea have been writing and working on AI issues. Japan, unsurprisingly, also has a lot of people working on these topics. And India, surprisingly, has a number of people. But I wanted to include also people from other countries, and that became more difficult because in countries where they don't have as much technology, or the technology presence is not as focused, there were fewer people writing on these topics. So it became a little bit more challenging. But in the end, I ended up putting together a committee with 8 other members. And I think we got a pretty good representation of different countries and different backgrounds. We'll see, unfortunately, there's some areas where there's not as much diversity, and we can talk about that a little bit later. So I put together this group and I submitted to the Pontifical Council for Culture, and they approved, and we began meeting in October of last year. So the group consists of Bishop Paul Tai, who is he's not the director of the Pontifical Council for Culture, but he is one of the leading organizers, and he's in charge especially of digital culture aspects. And Mr. Angel Gonzalez Ferrer, who is a technician working alongside. So these two, they work in Rome, And so that actually became a little bit of a challenge, because now we had to navigate time zones that went from eventually Australia all the way to Rome, which makes it actually the worst time for anybody from North America if they wanted to join, but ended up accommodating most of the Eastern Hemisphere. Hachul Son, who is a philosopher, Korean philosopher, and Hyun Kim, another affiliate of CTNS, theologian in Seoul. And then Robert Boyles, who is a philosopher in the Philippines. Angelo, forgetting his last name, Chakatari, I think, is a priest in India who's also a computer scientist. So he has a background with not AI specifically, but he knows the technology a lot better than most other people. I should have refreshed my memory. Takeshi Kimura, who is he is a sociologist of religion in Japan, and he's written about a lot about robots and AI in relation to Buddhism and Shinto. Lawrence Newmore, who is a education researcher in Darwin, Australia, but also has done a lot of work, ethnographies of Indonesia and the way people in Indonesia use technologies. Jacqueline Neo, who is a lawyer, law scholar in Singapore, and Gregory Samarati, who is a priest as well and a moral theologian in India, who's written about issues related to the lower caste and the outcasts in India and how their labor is often exploited. So this group, all of them have at some point written and taught and discussed issues related to AI. And so this is why all of them were included. And they represent a very broad perspective, people who are, of course, Catholic priests and Protestant philosophers or theologians, but also people who have backgrounds talking about Buddhism and Shinto, and even Jacqueline, for example, she works on legal issues tied to religion and digital technologies. So they were a very interesting group to put together, because none of them had the same interests specifically, and they represented a very broad group of thinkers and different perspectives, and all of these different countries, which became very useful in thinking about a lot of different ways the technologies would be affecting us besides what was obvious. And I think this is the important thing I want to focus on, is that there were issues that when we talked about with an American audience, there were some very obvious answers. And with a European audience, we might have very obvious answers, but they became very different answers when we talked with an Asian audience. And I have a really good example towards the end that we'll see. So these meetings, we started, as I said, in October, and it was just an introductory meeting. We didn't really discuss anything specific, but we got to know everybody. Everybody got to say hello. We found out people's backgrounds, and we just talked about what the general format would be. In November of last year, we just decided that we would focus on AI issues broadly across Asia. So this is also a fairly general meeting. We talked about AI regulation and what are the general concerns. And then in December, starting in December, and up until actually about a week ago, we had our 7th meeting. We focused on specific issues. So in December, we talked about so-called mechanical Turks, and I'll discuss that, what those are. That's one of the focuses I wanted to talk about towards the end, and issues broadly related to labor connected with AI. In January, we discussed AI and labor management and the way that AI would change what it means to be a manager, how that might change the way that managers focus on making judgments, planning, and taking care of all of the minutia that are involved in that work, and how that might actually affect the labor force in general. In February, we talked about big data for evangelization purposes. And I'll discuss this one again with a little bit more depth, so I'm just going to move on. And in March, we talked about facial recognition, both in private and governmental use. And this is another one that I want to focus on because it's a very interesting conversation. And then most recently, we talked about mediatization and belief and the way that social media sometimes exacerbate religious conflict, religious tensions, the way that religious leaders need to be attentive to the way algorithms tend to change our understandings of religious tolerance and good and bad side of that. So in February, we talked about big data. And the story that we focused on, in each meeting, we began with a reading I should go back. Each one of these, except for November and unfortunately also in March, all of these other meetings were led by our various members. And each one of them chose a topic. They chose a reading for the rest of the members to read, usually not very long, because for many of our readers, or nearly all of our members, English is a second language. And so we didn't want to overburden them. And then we prepared some discussion questions, and then the leader would lead the discussion for about an hour. And so these became very interesting to see what topics people chose, why they chose them. It's fairly organic. I chose AI issues broadly to introduce it and give people a sense of the direction we wanted to go or how we wanted to conduct meetings. And then in March, I led that one because we were having a hard time. A lot of people were very busy at that time of the semester. But the other ones, these were all topics people brought up for themselves they wanted to discuss. So in February, we read a story about a company called Glue, which is based here in the Bay Area. And they use social media. It's a service that many churches are using. They use social media to connect churches with people who are vulnerable. So they look at your posts, they look at things going on your timeline, and they sort of flag this as, oh, this person is in crisis. This person is having mental health issues. This person needs somebody to connect to. And they share this information with churches, so then churches can reach out and say, hey, are you looking for answers? Do you want to talk to somebody? Most of the people in the group noted that their experience of worship would be very difficult to implement with this because nearly all of them were used to actually small and local congregations. This model really works with large churches, mega churches, because a small congregation tends to be much more personally networked rather than through technology. So they thought that this wouldn't really work in places like India, where a lot of the religious congregations were themselves not only minority, but also somewhat isolated and regionally bound, even to places like the Philippines, where a very large percentage of the population is Catholic, but they do tend to be regionally bound to parishes. It was surprising, even our Australian member, who is, Australia is the home of Hillsong Church. He still, noted that in his experience, most people favor smaller or local congregations. So this was a bit challenging for most countries that we looked at. The biggest concern that all of our participants noted was the issue of privacy, that the things I'm posting on social media just being used to connect people or contact people seemed to be a violation of the expected privacy that one has. Of course, we do know that privacy policies for many of these social media companies do allow them to sell your data to third parties, and you should be aware of that when you're signing up. But knowing that a church which is reaching out to you has access to that data is a bit disturbing. So some of the concerns we had, one of the focuses that came out of this conversation is we began talking about multi-site churches. The discussion leader is an anthropologist who was working at, actually she did her PhD at UC Berkeley, and this is how I know her. She was just a guest speaker for this time, and she happened to be doing work in Korea during the few months that we had these conversations. So she noted that she had studied multi-site churches in Korea. And so she focused on the way that she wanted to talk about this because it's another example of using technology in a way of ecclesiology. The churches she tends to look at have satellite branches that broadcast the main the pastor's sermon. So all of our participants agree that this model was very difficult for traditional relationships of pastoral ministry. If you're really supposed to be reaching out to your congregants, it's very difficult to do that if you're just relying on social media. It's sort of something about that felt artificial or felt like it didn't really fit into their expectations of pastoral ministry. Many felt that this was a way of trying to bring people to God, and it feels like gaming grace. Like you happen to be vulnerable. I can tell by your Facebook post. So here's the solution, right? We've got the right answer here. And so some people talked about this seemed to be good in some aspects because there was a way to connect people through social media to digital or through to churches, right? So that if you did have actual interest, or maybe you didn't know if you had interest, this could be helpful. But some expressed skepticism. One participant actually discussed this as an issue of idolatry, that by relying on technology instead of relying on God to do the work, this feels like we're setting people up to put their trust in the algorithm rather than trust in God. A greater concern, though, was how believers would think if they knew how their data was being used. So this might be a good way to bring people in, but what if they find out how they were brought in? If they find out that the reason the church reached out to them was because of their posts on social media, because they were expressing pain because of a divorce, or because isolation because of COVID, or they were just struggling with unemployment or something. If they find out that a church had exploited that data, that could be really traumatic, and it could be very damaging, destructive for people's faith in general. So a lot of people expressed this concern in our meeting. There were two related concerns that came out of here as well. So as the conversation went on, sometimes what happens in these conversations is that we go on tracks that we don't expect. And that's actually a very great thing that happens, because I end up learning a lot. I end up learning a lot about other traditions and different beliefs and issues that I hadn't thought about. So our Indian members talked about a Hindu national anti-conversion bill that was that many politicians were trying to get passed in the parliament in India. And they noted that in recent years, there's been a rapid rise of Hindu nationalism. And because of this, India, even though it's a very religiously diverse country with Sikhism and Jainism and Zoroastrianism and Islam and Christianity and various branches of Hinduism, despite this, religious pluralism is under attack in India. And the priests themselves express a lot of worry and concern about the safety of their congregants and themselves. So Hindu nationals have been pushing these bills to say, well, we can't let people convert. If people convert to Christianity, then the pastor should be arrested. So a service like Glue, which might work in the US and in Europe and in countries where Christianity is already flourishing, would definitely not be allowed in India. If they try to implement it, then this would actually provoke nationalist outrage. The people who are getting a lot of this attention, who are rallying under Hindu nationalism, they would use this as an excuse to actually push their bills further, to persecute Christians even more, because they would say, look, they're using this Western technology to try to change our culture, to try to undo our way of life. This was a very interesting perspective and a very worrying thing to hear from our members. A second perspective that came out of this, second interesting concern, was record-keeping software that is used in some Korean Protestant churches. And the member who discussed this noted that a lot of churches in Korea use a software program to keep track of members, basically a sort of Excel sheet or QuickBooks, some sort of just record keeping thing, just noting this person, I visited him or her and they asked me to pray about this issue. Just a way of keeping tabs on people. Ideally, it's supposed to be very helpful, right? The problem that comes up with this is if the church staff changes, and in many churches in Korea, the junior pastors often rotate through. If they get a job as a senior pastor, then they move on. Somebody who is an MDiv student might come in as a junior pastor, or if they're waiting for ordination, they may work as a junior pastor. So the church staff changes a lot. And if the church staff is changing, well, who all has access to these records? And beyond the church staff, who has access to these records? And a lot of people don't know, and the member who brought this up said he himself didn't know who has access to this. And that can be troubling, because if you're talking with your pastor about something that's very sensitive, you wouldn't want, anybody to have access to that. So these were issues that came up in our discussion about algorithms and sort of evangelization efforts. The conversation we had in March was about facial recognition. And it was interesting to compare the differences between the United States context, the way that facial recognition has been talked about here. Of course, this is a major issue of AI ethics, and the way that it's considered, and the issues that come up in Asia. So in the US, a lot of the conversations about facial recognition software deal with law enforcement, discrimination, military use, surveillance. These are the common threads that a lot of AI ethics papers run on. In the Asian context, though, we discussed that some countries see this as being very important. Some countries want to use more of it. China, of course, has been one of the leaders in developing facial recognition software, and it's ideally going to be implemented in something like the social credit system. It's also possibly a very powerful tool for a country of 1.4 billion people. Korea wants to use it more to be able to facilitate people moving around the country, keep track of crime and so forth. In Singapore, our Singapore member mentioned that she saw that it was being used in the airport for immigration. People coming into the country could use this just as a way to come through and go out. They wouldn't have to show their passports. It'd be easier on everybody. Some countries saw this, some people saw this as not being really feasible for their country. Philippines and India were the two main ones that we heard this as not really being a feasible on a large scale. This technology wouldn't really have much impact. The Philippines, in part because they have taken, and both actually the Philippines and India have a national system to keep track of people, something like the social security number, but they've been very slow to implement them. Not everybody has these numbers or these cards. They don't have a national ID. And so getting something like a national database of facial recognition software would not work. It just didn't seem to be something that they could accomplish. In India, a big part of that is because they don't have the infrastructure, and the population being over 1 billion people would be very difficult to implement. In the Philippines, part of it was infrastructure, but a lot of it was just cultural view. They didn't really see it as being necessary, as being a big push. There hasn't been as much interest in controlling the population the way that many other countries have. And some countries have been focusing on private use. So Singapore, the Singaporean government has implemented regulations for private use of facial recognition software. And there are a lot of private companies that are trying to use it. Japan, of course, they don't have much. They do have a lot of facial recognition software that they've used in public settings, but there's more interest in developing it for personal use or for companies who are doing like admissions to theme parks and so forth. So we had various different positions that came out of this. The big questions that arose, the two issues that we saw that our members noted as being the most prescient for facial recognition were related to accuracy and use. The question of accuracy, of course, we see discussed a lot here in the United States. In the US, you often hear about racial or racist AI because in the United States context, a lot of facial recognition software has been trained on predominantly white male faces, and it has a very high accuracy rating for white men, very low or not as high accuracy rating for people of color, especially Black people, and actually also a fairly low or a lower accuracy rating for women in general. You see this also in Asia. in China, their facial recognition software is very good at detecting Han Chinese faces. So very high accuracy rating. Anybody who's not Han Chinese, it gets much lower. So I don't know how it would detect my face, probably not as accurate as a US system would, but this is also a concern, of course, in any country that's developing this. The use issue was very interesting though, because this was a little bit different. We saw some of our members noted that there are good uses of facial recognition software. Some of the Indian members mentioned that with COVID, hospitals being overrun as they are, we don't want a lot of contact with people, so they can be used to help us identify patients who are coming in, to be able to facilitate that entry better. In places like in senior living facilities, they mentioned that it's sometimes hard to keep track of members, especially if they have dementia, and they may be wandering around, and if you don't have enough staff to take care of them, it can be used for tracking where people are. People mentioned banking software with a lot of banking scams going on. You don't want a phone call from your bank that is actually not from your bank. So being able to confirm who you are by not putting in a password or a PIN code, but using your face might actually be better. And there's a lot of discussion with emergency services. If you get in a car crash, if they can, use facial recognition to know who you are, it can be helpful for communicating with your loved ones so that they know what happened to you. But of course, there was a lot of discussion about bad use of facial recognition. Social scores, social credit scores, of course, were one of the big issues that came up. And one of the issues that came up especially was that even though China has gotten a lot of attention on this, it's not just being used for Chinese citizens. If you enter China, you get put in the database. And so this was very troubling for many people. Our Indian members mentioned as well, again, the issue of ethnic or religious discrimination, that because of tensions related to Hindu nationalism, and of course the caste system and other forms of racism that exist, they were worried that this could be used for targeting undesirables or people who are seen as troublesome in society. And there was some ambiguity around the topic of security. Of course, security is one of the largest interests for using facial recognition software. We can think in the United States context all the way back to the Boston Marathon bombing back in 2013, trying to find who the bombers were. So there is some concern about protecting people from crime, but a lot of our members noted that even though that might be a good use, it's very easy to abuse that. And of course, in the United States context, we've seen that. So many cities have banned the use of facial recognition for police work. So a lot of the conversations we saw surrounding facial recognition parallel what we see in the United States. But the specific issues of religious and ethnic discrimination, the good uses, potential uses, were things that I hadn't heard much of in a lot of conversations here. And so that was a very interesting way to understand what are the concerns and how is this being used and how may it not be used? Because again, in India and the Philippines, it didn't seem like it would be a very feasible outcome. And finally, one of the big concerns that a lot of our members had to do with labor. So we actually had a few meetings on labor. Most of our scholars identified this as one of the major concerns for AI in Asia. How is this going to affect a continent where a lot of labor is already somewhat precarious? Will laborers be replaced? That was an important question. And how will they be replaced? Are we going to see people working in already low-paying jobs losing those jobs? What new jobs can be created by AI? Of course, there's hopefully a positive side, and there was a positive side I'll mention in a moment. How will AI affect global labor relations and economic disparities? How is this going to affect not just the people in Asia, but the fact that a lot of Western countries rely on global labor for the United States and other Western countries to thrive economically. The wealth that we have, a lot of it is connected to these global relations. What if we displace a lot of that labor? How do we disrupt the economic relationships? How does that affect these disparities? Will AI affect disadvantaged workers? How will it affect people who are already at risk? What will it mean for global productivity? Will this increase productivity? How will this affect global markets? And how will it affect management decisions? These were a lot of the conversations, a lot of the discussions and concerns that we had in national economy specifically. So one of the meetings in January, we talked about mechanical Turks. A mechanical Turk is what a mechanical Turk actually is it's a trick where it looks, a few centuries ago, there was this supposedly completely automated clockwork chess game. And you could play chess against this machine. Now, this was, of course, before Deep Blue. This was before we actually had machines that could play chess. And it seemed to play chess against you. Well, what happened was this machine had a box, and on the inside of the box, there was a person who was moving the chess pieces. So that person is called a mechanical Turk. AI itself must be trained with data sets that are labeled. And so a lot of early forms of AI, there was a lot of, idea that this would be really good for, say, delivering food. So that the little Kiwi bots that used to drive around Berkeley. Initially, these were actually piloted by people. And then once they developed the technology well enough and the AI could manage on its own, then they could let the little robots go by themselves. AI can't just, you can't just have machine learning, pick up a book and learn. It has to be trained, it has to be instructed about which parts are doing what. So somebody does this labeling, and this data tagging is necessary, but it's tedious and it's fairly low skilled. You spend hours a day just marking things. This is A, this is B, this is C. An example of what you see with data labeling is in self-driving cars. When a car is driving, of course, the cameras are running and it's recording all this stuff. So mechanical Turks will take pictures that the car is taking, and it will identify things. This is a stop sign. And you have to trace carefully around the stop sign on the picture and label it a stop sign. This is a tree, and you have to trace carefully around the tree. This is a tree. This is a person, you have to trace carefully around the person. And so this helps when you do enough of this and you label enough data, then the AI, the machine learning, can begin to identify these things on its own. But it takes all of this data to be labeled, and there are thousands of people who are involved in this. The largest data tagging company is a company near Beijing. A lot of work is being done in poorer countries, aside from outside of China, so Brazil, the Philippines, and so forth. Data tagging doesn't pay much, certainly not programming money. If you're thinking about how much money goes into AI and how much people are making, it's not these people who are making that money. This is very low paid because, again, it is tedious. And one of the conversations that we had then was with global networks, data tagging does not need to be done. To me, it seemed that this was going to be a problem about exploiting labor, about people being replaced or people being exploited so that they're being paid very low wages. But it turns out that the perspectives I heard in this, some people agree that this was a big concern. If in a country like Korea, where the GDP is higher, the cost of living is higher, it was a concern that these wages would not be sufficient. But it turns out that, well, in a country like Korea, they're probably not going to be hiring people to do this work because they can export it. They can export it to a country where they can pay people less. So there is some definite concern about de-skilling laborers. This is a sort of a dead-end career as well. If you do your job well, you put yourself out of a job, right? If you train the AI to be able to do what it's supposed to do, then it no longer needs you. And so this was a concern, of course, that we might be having people do this work for a few years, maybe up to a decade, but if AI really does catch up and doesn't need people to train the data, then all of those people lose the jobs that they have. So there was definitely some concern about that. But there was also some concern about how this would affect exploited global labor markets. And a very interesting conversation emerged from this between two of our members. This is between Jacqueline and Robert. Jacqueline, again, is from Singapore. Singapore is a small, basically nation state or city state, about 5 million people at the tip of Malaysia. It's a fairly wealthy country. And of course, the Philippines is a large island country, fairly poor, spread out, and much lower technology threshold compared to Singapore. So Jacqueline said, Singapore outsources a lot of its labor because of its small size. Oh, I need to reduce this so I can see. Move this. The ability to outsource this labor then allows Singapore to rely on importing foreign labor. This is good because it allows people to work for Singapore without having to relocate, but it reinforces nationalist tendencies about who is Singaporean. If I can outsource something and do it cheaply, then I don't have to directly face what is happening in this economy. We benefit without facing the externalities of these technologies, but this can be good for other countries like the Philippines, which is an immigrant sending country, which can benefit the local economy rather than exporting labor and money. It will be interesting to see how this might impact immigration patterns. Robert said, in other countries, this work may be considered low paying, but here this amounts to either minimum wage or above minimum pay. So this is welcome in the Philippines. Jacqueline notes, additionally, sending the money to the Philippines will go further for lower cost of living than it will here in Singapore. And Robert says, you are correct. Also, as compared to doing manual labor, this sort of work will be much more comfortable. There's a very interesting perspective that I hadn't considered. And as somebody who's been living in Hong Kong for the last 5 months, I know that this is a very interesting dynamic. We do see some of in the United States, but not the same way. So we do have immigration, of course. We have immigrant workers coming to the United States, mostly from Central and South America. In places like Singapore and Hong Kong, you get a lot of immigrant labor coming from the Philippines and Indonesia. In fact, in Hong Kong, about 5% of the population is either Filipino or Indonesian. And a lot of them are domestic helpers, people who work as maids, basically, and people who can afford to have a maid, which is actually a fairly large portion of the population. They work in their homes. If you go out on a Sunday, which is typically their day off, and wander around Hong Kong, it's the most striking scene. You will see thousands of Filipino and Indonesian women sitting in the parks, sitting in the terraces, sitting on the walkways, talking, chatting, singing karaoke, dancing. This is because they don't want to go home because they usually live in the home where they work. This is their time to go play with their friends, the time to actually enjoy. And you just get struck by how many people are here. Of course, they're sending money back home. They're taking care of their families, but it's a long way. Singapore and Hong Kong are not very close to Indonesia and the Philippines. So if people can work in their home countries, in the Philippines, instead of having to go abroad, even though this is tedious labor, it's welcome because it's not backbreaking labor. It's not like the people who are going to Singapore to do construction. It's not labor that's going to put them away from their families. And so this was a great opportunity. This was seen as a great opportunity for poorer countries because this labor could be done in a nice air-conditioned building in the middle of the summer, which is important when you live in a tropical area. And it would be paying better than you would normally get in your home country. So this was an aspect that a lot of people in the United States and Europe probably wouldn't expect. And getting these perspectives from Jacqueline, again, coming from a country that is fairly wealthy, that does rely on a lot of immigrant labor, and Robert coming from a country that sends a lot of labor out. This was a very fascinating dynamic. This conversation just blew me away, the interesting back and forth that went here. So this is a sort of, of course, we've had a lot more conversations, and this is only a snapshot of, again, 7 meetings we've had so far. We'll have our next meeting in June, and hopefully the topic will be about about the role that religion has in shaping AI policy in different countries. Of course, the United States and Europe, we know that there is a sort of tenuous relationship, church and state separation, and should church groups lobby Congress? But in other countries, that dynamic is different, right? What does it look like in a country like the Philippines that is predominantly Catholic? What does it look like in Japan, where Shinto is the primary religion, and then Buddhism afterwards, and Christianity is very small? Or in China, where the reason I don't have any Chinese members on our committee is because the relationship between the Vatican and Beijing is a bit tense. So I was told not to recruit anybody, unfortunately, from the mainland. So these are important questions, and there are many, many, many other questions that I hope that we will be discussing in the future. Some of our members have written and talked about issues related to sex bots, to lethal automated weapon systems, to self-driving cars, to education, and so forth. And hopefully these will be conversations that we learn a lot more going forward. So it's important to note, in the end, China is already poised to be the AI leader of the world. Already they are producing as much, and at this point, a bit more than the United States in terms of AI research. Korea and Japan are catching up. Japan had been, of course, one of the leaders for a long time, as well as Hong Kong. But when AlphaGo beat Go champion Lee Sedol back in 2017, both Korea and China earmarked billions of dollars towards AI research. And so both countries are really rapidly expanding their research. Outside of a Western context, we know that the role of religion in public is less privileged. We don't have the same sense that this is a Christian country. You can't really say that in most of the countries where we're working. You might be able to say that about the Philippines, but you can't say that certainly about Hong Kong, about Japan, and even you can't really say that about Korea. So the role of religion in general is not as dynamic. And this is an interesting area that we need to consider what that will look like, what will be the Vatican's ability to determine or shape or impact discussions in these countries. Poor Asian countries, of course, are not as directly affected by the implementation of AI. They're not as concerned about AI being used in infrastructure or by private companies in their country, but of course they do bear unintended consequences, many of which are related to not only labor, but issues related to the environment, because AI is a very energy consuming technology. You may be aware that this last year, NVIDIA, which is a graphics processing, mostly known for developing graphics processors, they went from being a company that wasn't obscure, but certainly not major contender, to being in the top 10 by market share in the world, because people have been buying a lot of these high-end graphics processors, which require a lot of energy to do machine learning. And so there's a lot of unfortunate climate impact from AI, and that will affect poor countries as well. And of course, there are issues related to data tagging and discrimination and so forth. Of course, not all poor countries are the same. And that's also important to note. The way that things will impact the Philippines is different than the way they're impacting Thailand or India. India has a few places that are fairly wealthy, has actually a very well-developed tech sector at this point in Hyderabad. Thailand also is developing a lot of AI. In fact, there's a lot of work going on in Bangkok. The Philippines, maybe in Manila, you would see that, but they're not experiencing it the same way. And you don't experience the issues of Hindu nationalism in Thailand that you do in India, but they do have their own issues that they have to grapple with. And of course, there are a lot of voices that need to be heard in these conversations. Although we do have members who work closely with Buddhism or Confucianism, we don't have a lot of members who strongly profess these backgrounds. We don't have like a Buddhist priest on our committee We don't really have anybody from a shamanist perspective. Taoism is fairly unrepresented, or indigenous perspectives. And unfortunately, as you may have noted from looking at the slide with our members, we only have one woman's voice. And that has been a greatly unfortunate reality, because we know that many women's voices are excluded already from a lot of these conversations. And needing to increase the perspective of feminist voices is very important lacuna at this time. So with all of this, in the end, I think that the upshot is basically Western countries need to start paying attention to how this technology, which has a global reach, global impact, is affecting Asian countries, not only Asian countries, but also African nations and South American nations, who we don't have any committees for in this group, the Pontifical Council, and how other cultures not only understand AI, but how it affects the labor, the economic situation, politics. Hindu nationalism has been a very interesting central element of a lot of our discussions in this AI group, because this is where religion and politics and AI can clash in a way that is extremely disconcerting. And so we need to have these conversations going beyond just the scope of Western perspectives. And so I'm looking forward to seeing how these conversations play out in the continuing months. Hopefully, hopefully this will culminate in a conference, although that's somewhat tenuous right now. But I'm excited to see how these voices are being heard and how they will continue to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for questions. Let's see how our meeting goes.
So if you have any questions, I think you can either put them in the chat or...
Oh yeah, you may need to pop out the question and answer. That's a separate category than the chat too.
Oh, Q&A, okay.
Yeah, I mean, people can choose.
Yeah, you can put them in the chat, or you can put them in the question box, or feel free to raise your hand. Although we can't see you guys, I guess.
We can't see them raising hands.
Well, if they use the raise the hand button, it will show up on the participant list. I might go ahead and start then. So do you foresee this group going forward for an indefinite period of time, or has the council put a sort of a time limit on the interaction?
Yeah, so I think initially the council wanted to, back in 2021, last year, they wanted to bring the various groups that had existed at that time together for a central discussion. I don't know if that actually played out, because I've been in Asia for the last, actually for the last year. I was in Korea for about 6 months, and then Hong Kong the last 5 months. But they don't have any, at this time, we don't have any definite endpoint. This has been actually an interesting point of conversation within the group, because they want to know, what is our trajectory? What is our goal? And it's somewhat open-ended. On one hand, the Vatican is a state, so there is some interest in national or international relations. On the other hand, of course, the Vatican is the seat of the headquarters of a church that has more than 1 billion people. So there's also concern about, is there something we can do to promote, will a document come out of this, for example? That's been sort of a hope for a while, although what that document will be, the magisterial authority of that is very much not even on the table. Right now, it's a lot of information gathering. There has been some policy suggestions, because the Vatican is a member state of the EU, so they have been participating in some of that conversation. And then thinking about more specifically how we can maybe shape conversations in individual countries, because we have Catholic members in basically every country. How can they be involved in shaping these issues in these conversations? So there's not an end point at this point, and right now we're hoping to get a lot more information and perspectives from Asia. So hopefully it will continue for at least a year or so.
Questions about Korea? So I'm interested. I was involved with the Pontifical Council for Culture years ago. They got a major grant from Temple Foundation to try to bring courses in science and religion to the Pontifical Academies in Rome. There are about 6. And it was really interesting 4 or 5 year project. I'm trying to remember the name of the cardinal who was under, I knew him pretty well at the time. We had a major national conference on evolution and theology. And that might have opened some of these doors, because your project is not related to that directly, but that's kind of like a foundation for asking these applied technology and ethics questions. And it's the same DCC. Do you have interaction with the cardinal who heads the PCC?
I have not personally, no. My interaction has been just with Monsignor Tai, primarily. He's and there was the interesting thing is right now my school, Hong Kong Baptist University. So I mentioned that we're hoping to have a conference, and Bishop Tai and Angel had said, if we do this, of course, we need somewhere to have the conference. Well, there are not many places where you can hold a conference like that. Korea would be maybe ideal, but of course, you guys will be having a conference there already. So it's kind of like sort of stepping on your toes almost to try to follow up in Seoul or something. So I recommended my school, and my colleagues got very excited about this idea, especially one of the research directions of Hong Kong Baptist University is AI generally. And we have a theoretical and ethical AI lab that sponsors a lot of research. So, and a Center for Applied Ethics as well. So we wanted to sort of use a lot of this momentum and energy to host a conference. And we contacted, so we started very basic planning stages for that, very, very basic. Just what would this involve? Of course, one issue is if we're going to have it virtually, there's not too much concern. We just host it, and if we're going to have it in person, there's a lot of concern about when this could be. And right now in Hong Kong, COVID policies are still fairly strict. When I go back, I'll have to spend a week in quarantine.
Really?
Yeah. So it's better than when I went there originally. I had to spend 3 weeks in quarantine. Yeah. Yeah. So there's still a lot of concern about when we'd be able to have people coming from other countries. We began very basic planning for this, and then we had a conversation with the Pontifical Council, and it came up that one of the big concerns, of course, was this issue related to China. And even though Hong Kong still maintains a fair amount of autonomy because of the one country, two systems policy, it would look very bad for my school to say we're not inviting any Chinese scholars. On the other hand, it would not look good for the Pontifical Council to say we're hosting this conference and we're just letting Chinese scholars in without very careful international policy relations sort of things. So it ended up coming out that probably the best solution for this conference will be some form of them being participants, and unfortunately not hosts because of this whole debacle with how do we navigate this difficult relationship. So that would maybe include Bishop Paul and Angel coming in, but probably we couldn't get the cardinal to come in or something like that. That might be too much.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, right now, and then the hope would be that even after this, if this all went well and we didn't end up having having Beijing come down on us. And although my school is across the street from the barracks of the People's Liberation Army, hopefully they don't storm the conference or something. If it all went well, then this could be something that we might develop later into a better relationship, and perhaps it could be more flourishing. And it might be something like what you ended up doing. But that's all, again, it's all very much very tentative, and a lot of it is still very what's going to happen in the next year or 2 years, and how will things play out.
Tricky landmarks.
Yeah.
Looks like you have one in the chat and one in the Q&A. I think the one in the chat was first.
Okay. Has the study group outlined any goals or outcomes for this process? Yeah, good question. No, not really, and that's been somewhat intentional. Because, as I mentioned, right now, a lot of it is basically information gathering. This conference that again is very, very tentative right now, hopefully could result in a book. But what will this mean for the Vatican? It's hard to say. What will they do with this? Right now, a big part of their concern is that the Pontifical Council for Culture is really the forward-facing group of the outward-facing group of the Vatican. Their job is it used to be called something like the Council for Outreach to the Gentiles or something like that, and they realized that was a bit insensitive. So they want to be somewhat ambassadors to everybody who's not Catholic, and even people who are Catholic. So part of their interest is just, well, how do we have these conversations with people in different countries and different cultures in different industries? Right now, a big concern is how do we get tech talking with ethics leaders and policy makers and religious leaders? How do we actually have them having these conversations in a way that is fruitful and not just, not either myopic or just navel gazing? How do we really get somewhere where we have some mutual understanding? So that's sort of maybe the goal, but doesn't have specific outcomes or specific trajectory. And part of it is also, we want to see where things are going, what energy develops, which polls are we going to go on? And right now it's mostly a lot of fact finding. What are the opinions of the members of the group on the potential for artificial intelligence or the prospect of AI that possesses human equivalent intelligence? What is the cultural perception of such technology in members' countries? Is this something that the group is interested in researching? Yeah, good question. So there are some variations on this. Some people tend to be more skeptical that AGI may not be as feasible as a lot of people think it is. Some people, I don't know if I probably should name names, but some people are concerned that a lot of the expectations are just they're not based in good philosophy or good anthropology. And other people, some members have mentioned that this is actually an important question for us because of the relationship between emotions and rationality. We need to think about humanity. What does it mean to be a human? What does it mean to be a rational animal, or the animal component? So there is some concern, especially among the theologians and philosophers, of what the impact is. A lot of the other members, though, we have law scholars and sociologists and others who are working in the social sciences, and their concern is less about what that might mean. Of course, there is concern about what that might look like in different countries. So in Japan, for example, they're much more likely to embrace AGI as not only as a possibility, but also as something that they can integrate well into their culture, into their communities. They have been among the first to implement companion AIs, not just companions like a friend, but caring for people, especially people who are older who might need, care in a country with a shrinking population. You may have fewer opportunities to employ caregivers. So AI is being used in Japan for that. There's also a lot of discussion about sex robots and so forth. In Korea, there tends to be less sense that AI could be integrated into Korean citizenship, but it's not completely gone. It's not completely absent. I don't think I've heard much interest one way or another in the Philippines or in India as something that will likely happen. I think they're dealing with their own concerns about how to really recognize or experience full human rights, dealing with poverty. These are questions that many of our members in poorer countries aren't as interested in, but in countries that are more developed, that have more technology, more GDP, they do tend to ask these questions more. So it is something that has come up, and I think it might be something that we discuss in more depth if our members want to talk about that.
Right.
There was a hand up, but I didn't see the name associated with it, so I don't know if they're still here.
Anyone else have questions? Okay, well, before thanking Levi, let me just remind everyone that in just a little over a week, on May 19th, the G2 is hosting a retirement party for me here upstairs, 5 to 7. OUC.
Thank you, Matt, for posting the link.
Thanks, Matt.
So in the chat there, yeah, there's links for registration, either both online or in person.
Perfect. So let's thank Levi Checketts for a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Should we leave it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead and yeah.